Everything that I share with you today, I want to share under His sovereignty. I am going to be sharing from the heart, not from prepared notes. If I look a little bit rough, it's because I just got off the plane from Perth. And before Perth, I was in Adelaide, and before Adelaide, I was in Alice, and before Alice, I was in Darwin, and before Darwin, I was in Cairns, and before Cairns, I was in Tasmania. And before that, I was all around the southeast of the country. I haven't slept for 30 days nearly. I worked it out that I've probably flown about 50,000, well, I will by the time I get home on Monday night when I fly back to my family. I will have done about 50,000 kilometers in the time I've been, since I left them on the 24th of March. So I am a little bit rugged and I don't look shaven probably. It's because I'm not. I rolled out of bed at 4 o'clock and I got on the plane so I could be here with you today. So please bear with me if I appear, thank you. If I appear just a little bit tired, I am taking a little bit of stress, but I'm here on a... First of all, I'm the one who's honored here. I'm honored here because those poppies you had on the screen a moment ago, this is your special day. This is your special day that you've decided to spend a part of it not doing what you normally do, I guess, but coming to hear a non-Aussie with a little bit of a strange accent talk to you about that tiny little land so far away that I imagine because you're all here that either you have carried Israel on your heart for a long time or the activity surrounding Israel has pricked your curiosity. If you're a believer in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and you follow His word, then of course you've known about Israel ever since you started reading it, although some of you may have thought that you had replaced Israel because that's what the church taught for a long time. But of course the nation that has been regathered in their little land so far away from us today, literally on the other side pretty much of the world, is at the very center of our Bible, at the very center of our faith. The book is all about them, or the area where everything happened is their land, their country. And the one who came 2,000 years ago, we read in the New Testament that Jesus the Messiah is the same yesterday, today, and forever. He was welcomed when the wise men came looking for him, and they asked, where is he who is to be born King of the Jews? That was his original designation. That's his everlasting designation. He is the King of the Jews. And he's coming back to the Jewish people. Many of them don't know that he's been or don't believe that he's been once before. They're expecting his first coming. There's a relatively small number who believe he's coming back. As a Christian, I believe he's coming back. And as lovely as your country is, and as wonderful as Aussies are, I'm not saying that to suck up to you, by the way. He's going to zip right on overhead and keep going. He's returning to Jerusalem. He's coming back to the city that I have had this enormous privilege and blessing to call my home for more than half my lifetime. He's coming there. Just a little bit about me, because I really don't want to I need about 4 hours. Is that good? I actually normally often do, but all right. I'm just a little bit about me. I'm a South African, born into a missionary family. My bloodline goes back down my father's paternal side to the United States, down my father's maternal great-grandmother's side to Adelaide. I have a bit of a fruit mixture because she married a Kiwi, so I've kind of got different blood in my veins. But I was raised a Gentile. I was raised an evangelical. And at a very young age, 16 years old, felt the Lord call me to Israel. Moved there in 1991 as a journalist. Political reporter that I'd been in South Africa, felt God wanted me to go and work in an organization, some of you know it, the International Christian Embassy Jerusalem, to report on the news that fills our television screens, but to put it into, all that news into its biblical context. Because most of us, if we're honest, have our opinions about Israel informed by a secular media, that is, to put it mildly, anti-God, to put it mildly, prejudiced against Israel, to put it mildly, riven with anti-Semitism. That's what we watch. And almost every news media source dedicates its coverage of Israel to actually delegitimizing and demonizing that nation, and has brought them to the place where Israel today stands hated and alone in a world where they feel that they are completely on their own. We just sang about the fact that they're not. The one who brought them back to their land has brought them back to preserve them, to keep them safe. It's a painful process, and of course, since they returned out of war, and they've been in war, in cycles of war and terrorism and diplomatic activity for nearly 76 years now. And it's been a very difficult, painful 76 years for them. But God's got their back, and He's got their future, and it is secure. As hard as it looks right now, as difficult as it appears right now. I want to spend a little bit of time talking about Israel and a little bit more time talking about your country, because I'm here. And I'm here because of the connection between Israel and Australia. And any New Zealanders here? I have to tread very carefully. There we go. Anyone else from the United Kingdom here? The British Empire that once was? Okay, there, all right. So just make sure I remember. Can I also just get a sense here, is everybody here, you don't have to say, but is there anybody here who needs to be taught the basics of the gospel? The fact that Jesus was born, he lived and he worked and he ministered for 3 or so years, and then he was crucified and rose from the dead and ascended to heaven. I kind of imagine that most of you already are on that page if you're Christians. I'm only asking because I have been gently criticized for not talking about those very basic aspects of the gospel when I talk about Israel. So I just want to make sure that we're on the same page. I'm not here to preach the basics of the gospel. I'm here to talk about Israel, what God is doing with Israel, and to share what I have been learning as I've come to your nation since 2014, the first time I came here. And now this is my 7th visit in 10 years, learning about the unique part that Australia played in the past. Part of what you're celebrating today. And if you are on the page, and you should be because it's your history, and I really hope that you are, even though on Anzac Day you're thinking mostly about the very big sacrifices, the enormous amount of bloodletting that happened outside of Palestine, in Gallipoli and other places. If you have your attention fixed on the same part of this planet that God has His attention fixed on, which is the land of Israel, it's at the very center of His worldview. Our God, who never slumbers nor sleeps, was very clear when He told the Israelites that the land to which He was taking them is a land the Lord God looks upon from the beginning of the year to the end of the year. He never takes His eyes off that little land. And you say, yeah, well, He doesn't take His eyes off any other land either, but the point is He makes the point that Israel is at the prism of His eye. Israel is at the center of His vision. And every single thing that happens on this planet, everything, every war that was fought, every crisis that happens, there's a connection with Israel from the beginning until now. So that while the relatively small number of casualties that fell when the light horse charged Beersheba and later drove the Turks out over the Golan Heights after the charge at Semach, those relatively small battles, alongside the disastrous cost to your lives, to your diggers' lives on the other major battlefronts, it was all tied to what God is doing in Israel. It all has to do with the preparation for the return of the King. If anything I say today, if I want anything I say today to stay with you, it's that what's happening in Israel right now, this intense danger that they're facing, the global hostility, and the positioning of the Australian government towards Israel, all of this has to do with the coming of the King, the coming to earth of the kingdom of God. There are only two kingdoms, according to the Bible. The one is coming to be established on the throne of David in Jerusalem. The other is fighting tooth and nail to prevent that from happening. It's not a divided kingdom, it's united, whether it's in the military forces who are trying to develop nuclear weapons in Iran, or whether it's the woman who heads up your foreign ministry, or your prime minister, or those people in the White House, or in the State Department. It's one kingdom that is pushing back against what God is preparing to do and is determined to do, and that is to gather his people back, to keep them there, and to send the king. And the enemy of all of us, Israel's enemy, happens to be our enemy too. He's fighting tooth and nail. I landed here on March the 24th, and the only taxi I could find had a big Palestinian flag on the back seat. Covered the entire back window, and what was marked on there, what was penned on there was, "We fight for Palestine." That was my welcome to Sydney. Of course, I had come here to fight against Palestine, and that may register with some of you right away. It might sound a bit cryptic to others, but I will explain. The return of the people to their land, as I've mentioned before, has been a very painful process. It has cost an enormous number of Jewish lives, both to create an environment internationally where the world would in fact allow the Jews to reestablish their homeland, and then time after time since then, efforts to get them back out, either through violence or through diplomacy. And the nations of the world, the nations of the West, we used to call them Judeo-Christian nations. Australia is one, South Africa is one, which is where I come from. Their involvement in Israel from the early days of statehood which was initially at least supportive with the recognition of the independence of Israel declared in 1948, has over the years shifted direction so radically that, as I'm sure you probably know, the international community spends most of its time finding ways to draw a question mark around Israel's right to exist in its land, and to in fact wrest half of that land, the biblical heartland of it, away from the people of Israel. And that has been the journey that the world has been on with regards to Israel since 1948. Those cycles of violence, you can't get used to them, but in a way, Jewish people, they know their history. They know where they've come from. They know that there's always been this force against them. The Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, he was on TV about 2 weeks ago speaking to the nation before he went in for minor surgery. He's a strong man. He's a strong leader. He withstands pressures and assaults and hatred, and now, of course, the International Court of Justice wants to put out a warrant for his arrest, and along with other Israeli officials' arrests. But he withstands all of that, and he stands strong against international opposition and against domestic opposition. And he's led his country longer than any other political leader has led modern-day Israel. But he sounded a bit bewildered when he spoke to the nation. And he said to them, how is it possible that after what happened to us on October the 7th, and I'm assuming you all know what happened on October the 7th, I'm hoping I don't have to actually describe what happened. It shouldn't be necessary, because the monsters that carried out those crimes that until today are so difficult to actually repeat, they filmed it all and they sent it around the world, and everybody saw what happened. And everyone knows what happened, so that nobody is guiltless with regard to Israel. A line was drawn in the sand that day between pure satanic evil and the victims or the targets of that evil. And that line has divided Christians, it's divided churches, it's divided countries. It's divided families. And it's taken our moral temperature. Because knowing what happened, if you ask someone what he thinks about what happened on October the 7th, and he says, it was terrible, it was awful, most horrific things happened, but if you think about what happened on October the 7th, and you have the word but at the end of that sentence, as if there's some kind of explanation for it, or some kind of context that you can put it in, or as if it's anything other than pure evil, then today, anyone who holds that dissonance has a problem with morality. They don't recognize pure evil when they see it. It cost God a very painful price to confront us with that evil. He, of course, who in all of Israel's afflictions, all down through the centuries, has been afflicted, he experienced October the 7th. He knew it would happen. Up until that day, Israel was leaning on two kind of support beams. They got their security from their belief that the IDF was this wonderful army who, in coordination with the Mossad and the Shabak and the other intelligence agencies, would secure Israel's future, keep them from their enemies, ensure that something like October the 7th could never happen. That was the one pillar they were leaning on. And the other pillar they were leaning on was the United States of America. And both of those pillars have been taken away. The one by the shocking, and I'm not going to go down, and I don't have any time for the conspiracy theories that pop up in Christian circles when things happen. There have been conspiracy theories about what happened. How is it possible that the IDF and the Mossad could have been taken by surprise, and then there are all these stories out there? No, it was a catastrophic failure. Exactly 50 years after another catastrophic failure led to the Yom Kippur War. It was a failing. I want to kind of come into that day on a bit of a brighter note, if I may. The days leading up to October the 7th were the Feast of Tabernacles. How many of you have been to Jerusalem here? Oh, wow, that's not bad. What's wrong with the rest of you? I know that there are some folk here who have been to Israel since October the 7th, and there are some who were there Saturday a week ago when all those missiles came hurtling across from Iran. But normally when we come to Jerusalem, we come to the land where Jesus walked, and that's what Christians come to do. And of course, one of the things that I am is a tour guide, and so I enjoy welcoming people to the land and describing the amazing biblical stories that they're going to see the setting for. Although I do make it very clear from the start that they're not only coming to see the land of the past, they're coming to see the land of the present, which is heading forward to the land of the future. In the words of one of our great latter-day church fathers, his name was Spurgeon, preaching in 1864, he told his congregation concerning Israel, he said, "Israel is now blotted out from the map of nations. Her sons are scattered far and wide. Her daughters mourn beside all the rivers of the earth. Her sacred song is hushed. No king reigns in Jerusalem. She brings forth no governors among her tribes. But she is to be restored. She is to be restored as from the dead. When her own sons have given up all hope for her, then is God to appear for her. She is to be reorganized. Her scattered bones are to be brought together. There will be a native government again. There will again be the form of a body politic. A state shall be incorporated, and a king shall reign." He understood very clearly the biblical pattern. The ingathering of the exiles, the bones being brought back together, in their unbelief, in their state of disconnect, many of them from God altogether, most of them certainly from the Messiahship of Jesus, but they would be brought back in that state, and that they were on a journey preparing them for the coming of the king. And that one day the political state that today has a prime minister would, in fact, crown its king as he comes to the land. They understood that back then, and so did the Wesley brothers, and so did the great Presbyterian minister, Robert Murray M'Cheyne, who in the same period, just before the Jews began coming home, he challenged Christians with these words. And maybe this will challenge some of you, because if you're like me, and you may not be, but I grew up evangelical. I grew up Assemblies of God, Anglican, Methodist. But Israel was off my radar screen completely. I had no idea that they had any significance. But in the mid-1800s, M'Cheyne, just returning from the Holy Land, he addressed his congregants, and this is what he said. God has engraved Israel on the palms of his hands. Should we not engrave Israel on the palms of our hands? It is true that Israel is given for a little moment into the hand of our enemies, but it is as true that they are still the dearly beloved of his soul. Should we not give them the same place in our heart, which God gives them in his heart? Shall we be ashamed to cherish the same affection for Israel which our Heavenly Father cherishes? Shall we be ashamed to be unlike the world and like God in this peculiar love for Israel? The simple question for each one of us is, and for our beloved church, should we not share with God his peculiar affection for Israel? If we are filled with the Spirit of God, should we not love as he loves? Should we not engrave Israel on the palm of our hands? There are many Christians who, since another line was drawn in the land back in 1967 in the Six-Day War, when Israel returned to Jerusalem, and Bible teachers began to get really excited about the fact that Jerusalem was no longer trodden down by Gentiles. And they remembered what Jesus had said, that would mark the beginning of the end of time. And back then, an awakening grew in the church. And most of you are probably here, or many of you are probably here and have gone to Israel because of what happened coming out of the Six-Day War. Because there was this miraculous and unprecedented and unparalleled event. As a nation that had been scattered to the four corners of the earth and had been hunted and gone after for destruction for nearly 2,000 years, had come back to the land and come back to life, and now they were back in Jerusalem again. And there was that expectation. And since then, from 967 until the 7th of October, that was kind of where a lot of teaching increasingly in the Bible-believing church focused. The Jews are back in their land. Let's go visit them. Let's applaud them. Let's help them get home. Organizations were established like the Christian Embassy, Bridges for Peace, Christians for Israel, and others who even helped to raise money to bring plane loads of Jews to the land. And the wonderful miracle of them coming back and the land coming back to life. And that's why you who haven't been there yet need to come and see it, because it defies description. It defies description how that land is booming with prosperity and hope and growth and promise. And it's scripture coming true. It's prophecy coming true in front of our eyes. And so, by God's grace, at least some, although not many in the big picture of our fellow believers, have had our eyes opened, have had a veil taken off our eyes to the fact that Israel is still center to the whole story. When Jesus was in Galilee, he spoke to the crowds, but mostly the crowds didn't understand what he was saying, and his disciples asked him why he didn't explain it more easily, make it more easy for them. And he said to the disciples, "To you it has been given to understand the mysteries of the kingdom. It hasn't been given to the multitudes." And those of us who are in this place today, and in the many places I visited in Australia the last few weeks and before, who know that Israel is still God's special treasure. This is a revelation from God to us. This isn't something we've earned. It doesn't come from our own research any more than Peter's recognition of Jesus as the Messiah, the Son of God, came from his own understanding. God, as Jesus said, his Father revealed that to him, and the Lord has revealed that to some of us, but we're a minority in the church. We are. Most of our fellow believers are behind a veil when it comes to Israel. But there's been a lot of teaching, and there's been a lot of support, there's been a lot of excitement. I would say that a lot of us applaud Israel from the side. You know, we say, go for it, Israel. Fight the fight, bring your land back to life. It's wonderful what you're developing, what you've invented, your high-tech expertise and everything else that you're doing. We really love you, Israel. We pray for the peace of Jerusalem now and then. We may have meetings and what have you. I'm not talking to anyone here personally. I'm just saying in general. But a lot of Christian Christians who've had their eyes open to Israel are still supporting Israel, as it were, from the side, and carrying on with our Christian life as if there's still a disconnect somehow. It's a reality. What Mashane is talking about here, though, is moving into a whole different dimension. It's taking hold of Israel with the same words, using the terminology that we read in the book of Ruth that she used when she took hold of Naomi. She clung to her, almost with desperation. She said, "Don't push me away from you. Don't send me back. I'm going with you. Your people will be my people. Your God, my God. Where you go, I will go. Where you live, I will live. Only death should separate us." That was her commitment. And we do read in the prophets that actually in the times, in the days that we're living in, that Gentiles are going to take hold of the Jews with the same fierceness and say, "Let's go with you because we know that you have a future." Because you know what? He who keeps Israel doesn't slumber or sleep. He's got Israel's back. He doesn't have South Africa's back. He doesn't have Australia's back. We can't claim from the Word of God that our nations are protected by the one who watches over Israel. In fact, He extends incredible blessing to our nations, as He has to yours, as you, in the early days of your current form. I'm told these things by Aussies, so if I get it wrong, forgive me, okay? I'm still trying to learn. But from what I understand, modern-day Australia, you took your shape in that First World War because it cost you so dearly. It kind of made you what you are. It was kind of like a fire, a kiln out of which you came as a nation. And so many things about your national character that we non-Aussies admire and sometimes are a little bit afraid of, and so on and so forth, comes out of your very unique origins. And those origins were tied to a kind of a John the Baptist calling. What did you do? You went ahead and you prepared the way for the coming of Israel. You prepared the way for the Jewish people to come home. And you did that in many, many different battlefields, but of course most famously in those that took place in the land of Israel. And then during the Second World War, I spent yesterday a couple of hours with Calvin Crombie. Some of you know him. We had a wonderful fellowship time together. A great historian. And he just reminded me from another document, he reminded me how the Field Marshal Montgomery was recognized for the victories that he wrought and that the soldiers under him wrought at places like Tobruk and others in World War II, was recognized because what Britain had done and what your diggers had been involved in doing there is that you kept the Nazis from reaching the land of Israel. You kept them from coming there and carrying out the will, which Hitler had already obviously made very clear that he was set to do, to actually annihilate the Jews even in their land. And that's another incredible part of your history. And then there are other parts of your history where even in Operation Desert Storm, when Saddam Hussein fired Scud missiles at Israel back in 1991, Australian Special Forces were behind the lines in Iraq, sabotaging missile firing sites. You guys were there. You were involved. And here in your country, you opened the doors wide. You made a few mistakes on the way, and that's been acknowledged, but you opened your doors wide to Holocaust survivors, per capita more than any other country. And up until recently, the Jews of Australia really believed that they were living in another version of the Promised Land. They enjoyed their lives here. They felt safe here. They felt so secure here. In the early days of your nation, you were kind to Israel. You were kind to Israel whether you knew that you were being so or not. Whether those soldiers believed in, whether they were believers or whether they were atheists or agnostics, it doesn't matter. God decided, as He looked around the world and He said, who am I going to use to open up the way so that I can fulfill all the prophecies and bring back my people? And His eyes fell on the great Southlands, southern part of the world, and He said, from there you will come. And Winston Churchill stood with his mouth probably open a little bit, probably had a cigar in it, so it probably wasn't open. And he said, as he saw these men getting off their boats, he said, from the uttermost parts of the earth they have come to fulfill, how did he put it? In fulfillment of a destiny as yet not understood by mortal man. He saw something. The spirit of prophecy, I guess, came on him, as indeed it came on Malcolm Turnbull at the centenary of the Beersheba charge, when he said twice, he said, we are here assembled in Beersheba because we are honoring an extraordinary battle, an extraordinary campaign which both made history and fulfilled history. Did you hear him make that statement? Do you know what it means? What does it mean to fulfill history? The only way you can fulfill history is if you believe in prophecy. Otherwise, and he repeated it twice. So, in the early days of your youth as a nation, that's what Australia was. You were what some would call a sheep nation. You know what that means? Okay. When I arrived and got out of that taxi, listen, I had to take the taxi. Palestinian flag or not, it was 11:30 at night. I was in Sydney. I didn't know a single soul. I needed a bed. I took the taxi. I didn't talk to the man. I took a photograph of his number plate, though. And I went and sat on my hotel bed, and I'm doing a Bible read-through. And I just moved into Jeremiah. Jeremiah was called to be a prophet to the Gentiles. It was his calling, but when God sent him and he began his task, God sent him to the Jews, to Jerusalem specifically. And this is just, you're going to have to bear with me today because I'm carrying stuff here that's actually quite painful to share. Okay, so just bear with me. Jeremiah, who was known as the weeping prophet, he was sent by God to his dearly beloved Israel. And God said these words through him to Israel. He said, I remember you, the kindness of your youth, the love of your betrothal when you went after me in the wilderness, in a land not sown. Israel was holiness to the Lord, the first fruits of his increase. And I read that, and then I heard God say to me in my heart, I remember Australia. The kindness of her youth. We went after God in the wilderness, of course, for different reasons. But this was quickened to me, and I thought, well, this is to Israel, this is not to Australia. And yet I knew, because I've been here enough, and I've met enough Aussies both here and in Israel, and I know that there is a love, kind of almost a betrothal that some of you have had with Israel. You've embraced, or God in his place, as he calls himself Israel's husband. But from here, Jeremiah is then told to tell Israel that because they've lost their first love, because they have not been faithful to their husband, they were going to go into a very difficult future. So that's what I was carrying in my heart when I came here. But what I want to go quickly back to is how things were in Israel leading up to October the 7th. It was the feast of the Lord called the Feast of Tabernacles. And it's a feast in which you have to be happy. You have to be. No choice didn't matter. God says you will rejoice. 7 days and 7 nights you will rejoice. Doesn't matter if you've lost a loved one. It doesn't matter what you're experiencing. You will be happy. Not because life is good, but because there is God in heaven and he's your God and you are his people. And so you rejoice. And I've been through probably 33 of those, and some of them have been very dry and very difficult times, like in the Second Intifada, the beginning of the century, when for 4 years we had so much terrorism and tourism just disappeared. But over the years, the joy of the festival has returned, and last year was no exception, as hundreds of thousands of Jews made their way into Israel to come and celebrate the feast of the Lord. And I want to stress something here in case you don't know this. Many Christians are a little bit, what's a nice kind word to use, are a little bit unsure about where Jews stand in their relationship with God. Thinking because the Jewish people are not Christians or have not accepted Jesus as Messiah, that somehow they are. We often say when we talk about people in Israel, we say, well, they are believers if we're talking about people who believe in Jesus. But if others who do not believe in Jesus, we don't say the term believers. We don't use that term. But I'm here to tell you today that there are millions, literally millions of Jews in Israel who are more ardent, more passionate, more deeply in love and devoted to God than many, many Christians that I've met in my lifetime. They have a passion for him. They have a fear of him. And in the Feast of Tabernacles last year, they flooded down to the mountain of the Lord. The mountain of the Lord, you know where that is? Bet none of you have seen it. You can't mostly see it because it's in a box, surrounded by the walls, the Western Wall, where the Jews mainly stand and pray. And then on top there's a platform, and then there's that thing with the gold dome. Okay, so in that box, there's this mountain that for 2,000 years has been hidden from view. It's the mountain of the Lord. It's the place of God's throne. It's the place where he's going to put his son, even if all the nations of the world try and stop him. Go read Psalm 2 about his reaction to them. But they flocked down there with palm branches. We often think that we came up with ideas like Palm Sunday. No. They were already waving palm branches before the Lord long before the Christian version of the story happened. They flock down there and they worship God and they sing and they dance and they rejoice day and night. It's the most amazing time to be there. And then in the middle of that week, on the Wednesday leading up to the October the 7th, about 4,000 Christians who had come from around the world walked down the streets of Jerusalem with big banners, with their national flags, dressed in national costumes, and express their love for the Jewish people, their faith in the God of Israel and in his promises, and remind them that no matter what's happening in the world, God has brought you back because God has a glorious future for you. And we are Christians, and we're here to tell you we love you. And you see the tears, and you see the emotions, because for most Jews, Christians are their worst enemy. Because most anti-Semitism has come from people who call themselves Christians, much more than has ever come from the Islamic world. People calling themselves Christians have inflicted their hatred on the Jewish people. So these Christians flow through the streets and the whole place is joyful. And then we're heading down towards the end of the week and we're coming to the day, and I always like to say this because I want to like drive it home. Imagine if we went out once a year, just on one day a year, and we took our Bibles with us. And we went and we made a big cookout, and we got some music going, and we danced around with the Bible in the air, and we thanked God for giving us the Bible. All of us. All Christians. Imagine if we flocked out of our churches and we praised God and thanked him for giving us the Bible. Because that's what the Jews do. They read through the Bible, they read through the Torah, the books of Moses, and on the last day of the Feast of Tabernacles, they come and they rejoice before God because he's given them the Torah. And that was the climactic day we were expecting when I woke up at 5 o'clock on the morning of the 7th. And some of you have this already, the app that alerts me to the fact that rockets are incoming went off. Now, we've had rockets coming in for a long time. In 2003, I went down to the Gaza Strip, and there were lots of Jewish families living down there. There was a big industry, agricultural industry. And the Jews of Gush Katif and those other places, they lived side by side with the Arabs of Khan Yunis and of Gaza City and of Rafah. And the Arabs came in and out of the Jewish communities. They were friends, they worked together. Arabs flocked into Israel in their thousands to work and came back home with their pay packets. And the industry there was alive. It's desert, and you've seen the pictures from the war, you know it's just basically sand now. But it was a beautiful place. And then in one day, in 2005, the Israeli government sent in the police and the soldiers, and they pulled all the Jews out of their homes, put them on buses, and got them out of there. Every single last one, and closed the fence, and gave the keys to the Arabs, and they said, you can start building your state. And within weeks, the first rockets started coming over. Something which was predicted, which people knew would happen, which people warned the government would happen, but because of pressure from the world on Israel, it's always because of pressure from the world, Israel exposed its throat to what would come out of Gaza on October the 7th. Also, in those ensuing years, after the removal of the Jewish community, many of the Arabs came into the new towns that were constructed alongside the fence of Gaza. Places whose names you now know, like Be'eri and Kfar Aza, kibbutzim, where there were Jews who really believed that if you went the way the world was insisting that Israel went, and if you surrendered some of your land to the Arab side, if you participated in what has become known as this two-state solution and you began to enable it, that would actually lead to peace. The people who lived in those communities were the most avid believers in the idea of a two-state solution. And again, details I'm sure you've all heard and you already know, that the Arabs from Gaza that came and worked in their communities over those years and were being friendly to them and working with them and wishing them Shabbat Shalom on Friday afternoon and everything else, they were gathering the intelligence which they would hand over to Hamas so that when they came in on October the 7th, they knew exactly where to go and who to kill and how to kill them. And of course, what happened that morning was horrific because these rockets that started going off, and we were used to alarms, but they didn't stop. For an hour and a half, every second, there was another alarm going off. And then in Jerusalem, which is where I was staying, we heard the air raid sirens, so we knew the rockets were coming in. Cut a long story short, I made my way to the southern end to the western edge of Jerusalem, where one of my sons lives, and spent the day with him in and out of the bomb shelter. And we looked down from his home, we can see down towards the coastal plain, because Jerusalem's up on like mountains, and the Mediterranean is down here. So we were up on the mountains, and here's Gaza, and here's Tel Aviv. We were looking down, and we saw the rockets coming in, and every now and then we had to go to the bomb shelter. But what was disturbing was that there were no F-16s in the sky. There were no warplanes out there. None of that was happening until about 11:30. This started at just after 6:20 in the morning, and by 11:30 we started to hear warplanes. So there was this quiet period, and it was we didn't understand what was happening. And then we started to hear the reports coming out of Gaza, which were like, they sounded like somebody was hallucinating. Now, we're used to terrorism. When a bus blows up, you lose maybe 18 people in a bus bombing. Passover, Seder at a hotel in Netanya one year, I think there were about 70 people killed. Those are awful numbers. They're horrific. And between 2000 and 2004, there was a terror attack almost every day. So there was lots of death. There was lots of violence happening. But the figures, the numbers that we started to hear coming from Gaza, and the shock wave that went through the nation as they realized what had happened. When we went to bed that night, we had no idea of even half the number of people who had been butchered. We hardly heard any details about the hostage taking. But the nation went into ice-cold shock, even though we only had a small part of the picture. And that night when we turned on our TVs, there was this display, momentarily there was this display of international shock and reaction. And we saw the blue and white of the Israeli flag on the House of Commons and the Eiffel Tower, and the White House, and of course also on the Sydney Opera House. But a day later, that was all gone. And then another shock hit the country. When I landed here, one of my first visit when I got here was to Parliament House, and I spent some time with some of your politicians, and I'll talk about that in just a moment. But that same evening, 27th of March, I think, I met with some of the Jewish community in Canberra. And among them were two ladies in their 90s. Two ladies in their 90s, and they came up to me at the beginning of my time with them, and one of them said, you know, I'm old enough to remember what it was like in Europe in the 1930s. It's like that suddenly now here. And another woman came up to me and she said, I've hidden the details about what I experienced from my family. They know I was in the Holocaust. We all teach our kids about the Holocaust. But the details, they were hidden away. But on October the 8th, when I saw masses marching past the Sydney Opera House, and Australian policemen standing and allowing this to happen, and allowing the crowd to push the policemen back, and they were calling death to the Jews, and F the Jews, and gas the Jews, and all the things they were saying, we had our second shock wave, she said. For 75 years, we've been listening to prime ministers and presidents vow that never again will we allow such a thing to happen. But after October the 7th and then October the 8th, now we know that not only will they allow it to happen again, it probably will happen again. We just celebrated 75 years of nationhood. We thought we'd have another 75 years. Now we don't know if we'll have 20 more years. And what led to that awful confession of a most, and you have to understand, and I'm sure that you do, that when they came back to the land from the Holocaust, from the death camps, I mean, they almost literally crawled into the land. 90% of the citizens of the new state of Israel in 1948, 90% of them had lost a first-degree family member in the Holocaust. None of us, doesn't matter what experience our people have had, where we've come from, what national tragedies, we can't relate at all to the depths, to the graves, actually, out of which God brought them back to their land, and to the wonderful resurrection of life which they have lived in, and despite the hatred and despite the opposition, they have thrived in their belief that they will live, and that now that they're finally back in their land, all of those endless efforts to wipe them out, that's history. And I've sat with other Jews in your country here, also in Good Friday. I was in a home in Bondi Beach area. A few days later, I sat with a rabbi and a third-generation Australian Jew in Melbourne. And I know that what happened on October the 8th, not on October the 7th, that was awful. That's still being digested. We still haven't found all the bodies. We still don't know for sure whether there are 133 hostages, or maybe there's only 130, because maybe 3 of them were burnt to a cinder, and we don't know yet, because there's still bits and pieces of human remains that haven't been identified. Can you imagine, just stop for a moment, can you imagine this morning a man and his wife saw a video clip of their son without his arm. The last time they'd seen him, he'd been bundled onto the back of a ute, his arm shredded, and taken off into the tunnels, a hostage. And what is it now? 7 months nearly? Over 200 days? I'm not going to spare us on this because I don't think we should spare ourselves on this. Let's just try and imagine what it must be like. The hostages, we can't imagine. In the tunnels, experiencing who knows what. What we've heard from those that have been released, that were released in December, we know something about what maybe happened to them, but we don't even know if any of them are alive. This morning there was an argument. Hamas said, we can't tell you how many are alive, but we think there are more than you think. Maybe there are not as many dead as you think. Now, can you imagine how those parents and have you seen them night after night in Tel Aviv? Frantic. They will do anything to get their daughters, their parents, their kids back. And there's not one world leader who has picked up the phone, like Anthony Albanese picked up the phone and called Bibi Netanyahu when one Australian girl, God bless her soul, was accidentally killed by the IDF. And he bogged all over Netanyahu for what Israel had done to that one, but he hasn't got on the phone and bogged all over the Red Cross and said, get down there and go find out at least if they're still alive. Has one world leader put any pressure on the Red Cross to just go and find out whether these people are alive? No. And so their parents and their loved ones, and one of them is a red-headed baby. Some of them are girls who are carrying the babies of the terrorists who've been raping them repeatedly. I mean, it just defies description. It's beyond horror. And we carry on with our lives. We do. And of course, we have a built-in, I guess, self-defense mechanism. We can't keep it in front of our eyes all the time. But as you carry Israel in your prayers, can I ask you to think about keeping it in front of your eyes? Put those pictures up every day. Have a look at the faces of the girls. Imagine a whole nation traumatized. A whole nation. From Dan to Beersheba, the entire nation traumatized in a day. And now living with that trauma. And then the third shock wave hits them. When they hear coming from the mouth of Joe Biden, the solution to this conflict is that we must recognize Palestine. And the day after the war, that's what we're going to do. Rishi Sunak followed suit. So did Emmanuel Macron. This morning, Jamaica recognized Palestine. 2 days ago, Barbados recognized Palestine. Spain and Ireland and a couple of other European states are about to recognize Palestine. Palestine is a weapon. The purpose of Palestine is to destroy what will be left of Israel. It's always been that way since the founding of the Palestine Liberation Organization. In their minds, from their own mouths, we can't beat Israel in a war. So let's negotiate for as much land as we can get. When we need to use terror, we will use terror because the world will then press Israel to give us more land. And when we finally got our state, we will use that as a platform from which to drive the Jews into the sea, and Palestine will be free from the river to the sea. That's what the idea of this two-state solution sounds like now in the ears of the Jewish people in Israel, even those who once thought that by giving land to Arabs, there would be peace. Now they know that the two-state solution is just a 21st century version of the final solution. They know it will destroy them. And they know the world will let it happen. Not only will let it happen, but will actively participate. And I went into your parliament. Now, when I came here in 2014, you had a prime minister. I'm not messing into your domestic policies here, please. I'm not sticking my nose in that business. I don't want. I'm nothing to say about that. But what you had in 2014 was you had a prime minister that stood on the side of Israel and the Jewish narrative that that land belonged to the Jewish people, that Jewish settlements in Judea and Samaria were legal under international law. And when I came down, because the Lord brought me down, and I met with some of your Christian leaders, including some who are sitting here, and I said, I have this burden on my heart that your prime minister needs to be encouraged, because we always criticize our politicians. We've always got a bone to pick with them. But there's something that Tony Abbott should be encouraged in, and that is the stand he's taking towards Israel. So commend him. Let's commend him. And that was a momentum that gathered some steam, and there was a petition drafted, and it was submitted to the government in which it was commended for its stand on Israel, and then the plea was inserted, please do not recognize the state of Palestine. And just because it's the way that God does things, because there's no reason why your prime minister should give a South African who lives in Israel 2 minutes of his time, but the Lord opened the door for me to speak to him face to face. And in subsequent years, as I've come here, the Lord has again given me favor, and I'm nothing, I'm nobody. I have no influence in any direction. But doors opened, and people you vote for have invited me to sit and share the danger of this growing threat called the Palestinian state with them. And that would happen this year, right after I arrived here and had that, which I took as a confirmation from God. When I saw that Palestinian flag, I knew, this is why I'm here. And so I sat with 6 or 7 of your MPs and 2 of your senators. I didn't know how much time they would give me. It was the last day. They were about to go off on furlough. And so I just introduced myself very briefly, and then I threw a question at them, which I've carried around Australia with me. And every time I put it out there, I do so with shaking knees, because it's a really, I'll just tell you what it is. Is it possible that Australia would participate in another Holocaust of the Jews? Is it possible that this country would facilitate or help bring about the destruction of Israel? Could this country, with all of what you have in your history and your legacy, all that you've given the Jewish people, all that Jews have given Australia as they have been full citizens of this country, could this country participate in the global effort that endangers Israel's very existence and recognize Palestine and take Australia across a line that I don't think you will be able to reverse back over? They didn't throw me out. One man got up and left in a bit of a huff. He said he thought that my worldview was very pessimistic. But for 33 years, I have been sitting with my nose against a window pane, watching this scenario being prepared. My very first brief when I went to Israel in 1991 as a journalist was to go to the first International Middle East Peace Conference, where the whole idea of land for peace was rolled out. That was at Madrid, and 2 years later they had the Oslo Agreement signed, and then they had Oslo II, and then they had the Roadmap to Peace, and then they had the Annapolis Conference, and all these different things that probably most of you will have forgotten about, or maybe it wouldn't have impacted your lives too much if you weren't watching. But all the way along, all the way down up to the year 2000, screws were being turned on Israel. Give land, and you'll get peace, and we can put an end to this conflict. And in the year 2000, the Israeli Prime Minister went to Camp David and sat with a man by the name of Yasser Arafat in front of President Clinton. And Ehud Barak, the Prime Minister of Israel at that point, he said to Arafat, he said, Mr. Arafat, I'm going to give you this. You can have all of these things. You can have all of Gaza. You can have all of Judea and Samaria, except for maybe 2% or 3%. We have to just modify the border. You can have the old city of Jerusalem, Mr. Arafat. You can have the Western Wall. You can have the tombs where our fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, are buried. We will give you everything for peace, including our national treasures, our very heritage. Arafat rejected the offer and launched the second intifada. And in the next 4 years, of course, everybody went to funerals. As indeed, since October the 7th, everyone has gone to funerals. On January the 24th, in a hotel in Qatar, 5-star hotel, 2 leaders of the Hamas movement are staying there, 2 top leaders, Hania and Khaled Mash'al. And Mash'al gave an interview to Arabic language television. I think it was Al Jazeera. And I've got all of his words here verbatim. I'm not going to read them, but the gist of what he said was this. He said, you see, it works. We kill Jews, we get more land. We slaughter them, we get international support from the river to the sea. We rape them and burn their kids alive in front of them, and we do all these heinous things to them, and their friends in the world come out and say, we will insist on the creation of a Palestinian state. We will get our state because of what we did on October the 7th. It worked for us. And he's absolutely right. He's completely right. The whole forming of this organization, the Palestinian National Movement, it begins with an alliance with Adolf Hitler, and all down through its history, the very fact that there is a support for the Palestinian cause in the world today is because there were hijackings, some of you remember, in the 1970s. You remember when those Israeli athletes were murdered at the Olympic Games. You remember when Israeli ambassadors were being assassinated and restaurants were being blown up. The whole Palestinian Arab movement is violence. It's birthed in violence, and it has grown in violence, and it will achieve its violent end. And its violent end is the destruction of Israel, and the proof to the people of the Middle East, the answer to an age-old question: who is God? That's what this is all about. Who is God? All the wars that have been fought go back to the early days of Canaan, when another group of people lived in Gaza, called the Philistines. And when you went to war against your enemies back in those days, you went to war against their gods. So when the Philistines captured the God of Israel, the Ark of the Covenant, they celebrated their God, Dagon, and they put the Ark of God in front of their fish god, and in the morning he was on his face. And they picked him up and put him back in front of the God of Israel, because they understood God was in the box. That was their understanding. This was the Israelite God. He didn't have a shape. He didn't have a form. He was in the box. They'd captured him. They put him in front of their God, and their God falls on his face and breaks his hands and feet off. And then they get hemorrhoids and rats. And they can't. The God of Israel cannot stay with the Philistines. So eventually they send God back to his name is Yahweh, Jehovah, however you want to say his name. A little while later, another prophet comes to the northern kingdom, and he says, okay, you guys are confused about who is God. So let's go up onto Mount Carmel, and we'll work it out. We'll build 2 altars. You call on the name of your God first, and you can have all day. Go for it. And they did. Called on Baal or Baal. And then finally, Elijah called on Yahweh, Jehovah. He hardly had to open his mouth, and fire fell from heaven and consumed the whole thing. And all the people of Israel fell on their faces and said, now we know who is God. Jehovah is God. When they raped, when they burned, when they stabbed, when they ram, when they shoot, when they blow them up, when they drag them through the streets of Gaza, they cry praises to Allah. When Israel gives them land, they praise Allah. Allahu Akbar, which means Allah is greater. Greater than what? Greater than the God of the Jews. And they know from their book, from the Quran, that their God, Allah, is going to give them total victory over the Jews, and at the end of days, even nature will fight against the Jews. As the Quran says, every tree and every rock will cry out and say, "O Muslim, come, there's a Jew hiding behind me, come and kill him." The whole Land for Peace process has strengthened the faith of Muslims in the supremacy of their God. They believe with fervent, passionate conviction that Allah is greater. And they celebrate Him. And their highest goal is to die killing Jews in his name. The contrast couldn't be more vivid. That's a death cult. For the Jew, save one life, you save a universe. You can break God's law to save a life. As I hope you know, because I hope you're aware that when Joe Biden stands up and says 33,000 Arabs have been killed in Gaza, he has no idea what he's talking about. He's simply regurgitating propaganda lies that come from one source and one source only, the same source that in the early days of the war broadcast to the world that Israel had fired a rocket on a hospital and killed 500 people. The BBC published it, Sky UK published it as a fact. And then it turned out that it had actually been a Hamas rocket that had fallen back on a parking lot and 25 people had died. And I've been living in Israel for 33 years, and I know that Hamas lies about fatalities. And what's sickening is not that they lie, that's what they do. What's sickening is that our leaders parrot their lies and would suggest, as Biden has done and as Albanese has done, suggest that Israel indiscriminately kills civilians. I wish I had time. I told you I need 4 hours. I wish I could describe how Israel fights a war. No other army ever has fought a war the way Israel fights a war. We have now, I think the number is 363 soldiers that have fallen since Israel went into Gaza. If Israel had wanted to commit genocide, then on the morning of the 8th of October, they could have just sent in their bombers, squashed Gaza. Not one Israeli would have died. Not one soldier would have died. But Israeli soldiers die because Israel cares for human life. And here's another lie that I would like you to identify as a lie. Israel's fight against Gaza is not a war of revenge. It's not a war of revenge. When a Jew dies in an act of terror, the response from those in mourning is, may God avenge his blood. They are not a vengeful nation. I'm not saying that there aren't people who, seeing their loved ones blown to smithereens, won't lose it. But I'm saying as a nation, they are moral. The way they fight war is moral. I was sharing with Pam on the way here over from the airport about how, and I think, Pam, I think you told me, and the Warbies were in Jerusalem when the rockets came from Iran, a couple of weeks ago, no, a week and a half ago. And they were celebrating, the Arabs were celebrating in the Hinnom Valley, or the Kidron Valley, next to Silwan, next to the city of David. Even as the rockets were coming right near the Golden Dome, they were celebrating. And the thing is like, okay, well, how perverse is that? But actually, it's not perverse. That's what they do. This is a death cult. They worship death, and they teach their little girls in pink pinafores at the age of 3 that they should grow up to kill Jews. And this is all documented. It's out there for everyone to see. It's out there for our prime ministers to see. It's not some propaganda line. There's hatred. Both Mashal and Hania were teachers in UNRWA, the UNRWA, which is their school is supported by, among other things, your taxpayers' money. They raised kids who are now in the Hamas ranks. What's perverse is not what Hamas does. What's perverse is what our prime ministers and our presidents and our governments are willing to do. Close their eyes to what is glaring them in the face and come out, as a lady by the name of Wong did a few days ago, and say, let us recognize Palestine. The timing is not lost on me. I don't believe in coincidences. This brings me to, in a sense, the bottom line of why I'm here now. And this is hard to share because nobody likes to hear, just as indeed the people of Israel did not want to hear what came out of the mouth of Jeremiah. But God says, let me quickly read it to you. Ezekiel 33, God says, again the word of the Lord came to me, saying, Son of man, speak to the children of your people and say to them, when I, the Lord, bring a sword on your land. When I, the Lord, bring a sword on your land. And the people take a man from their territory and they make him their watchman. When he sees the sword coming upon the land, if he blows the trumpet and warns the people, then whoever hears the sound of the trumpet and does not take warning If the sword comes and takes him away, his blood shall be on his own head. He heard the warning, but he did not take heed. I don't attach a name to myself, and I have no desire to be labeled in any way, but God has put it on my heart so strongly. I have seen my country go down. I went to South Africa in 1993 when they all thought that that country was going to have a glorious future. Mandela was out, apartheid was gone, the Rainbow Nation was out there, and as I was flying down to speak at a couple of churches there, the Lord spoke very clearly to me and said, you need to tell Christians in South Africa that the country is going into darkness. There is no glorious future ahead for the country. The times of the Gentiles are coming to an end. I'm turning my face back to Zion. My favor is being restored to my people in their land, but the nations of the world, the Gentile nations, are going into shadow, and they are going to pay a price because of the way they have treated my people and my land. I spoke that in 2 churches. The one church did not want to hear it, even though I said to them, when darkness comes, that's when we shine brightest. We have to understand that when the things come on the earth, Jesus said things will come on the earth that will make men's hearts fail them for fear. When men's hearts fail them for fear because of the things coming on the earth, then that's when they're ripe for the gospel. That's when they're ready. They're looking around. They need to hear that there is hope in the Messiah, that God is a God of love. But he does send darkness. They didn't want to hear it in that church, but there was another congregation and they heard it. Their ministry was to the down and out. They took homeless people off the streets. They took drug addicts into their compound, cared for battered wives and so on. But at the center of their compound was a little chapel called the Israel Chapel. And every Friday afternoon they would gather. They'd stop their other work. They'd gather in the Israel Chapel and they'd pray for Israel. And they'd spend the Sabbath or Saturday, they would spend that day praying for and studying God's promises for Israel and aligning their ministry, even though their ministry had nothing to do with Israel or Jews, aligning their ministry with what's happening over there, because they understood that the Prince of Peace and the Son of and the Lion of Judah is coming to Jerusalem. And if as a church, and if as a human, as a Christian, you're aligned with what he's doing, you are plugged into there, that light will flow into your ministry here. Then you will have oil in your lamp. Then you will be able to shine. But if you turn against Israel, and this terrible reality that so many of our fellow God-loving Christians are actually going to war against God. They've been seduced by the lies, by this bleeding heart thing. They want to go out and support the destruction of Israel because they see the Arabs lying in the streets. And do I have to say that I'm not anti-Arab? Do I have to say that here? Do I have to say that I believe God loves every Arab as much as he loves every Jew? That God has far more compassion for the children who are blown to smithereens by Israeli bombs than I or you could ever have? But that those who have died, whatever the number, every single one of them, their death is at the hands of Hamas, not at the hands of Israel. Jew or Arab. That's the evil source. Too many of our fellow Christians are deceived. And instead of standing with God's purposes for Israel, they find themselves opposing him. But what God said when he spoke to Jeremiah, he said, I'm going to take a cup. And he says this also in Isaiah. He says, I'm going to take a cup and I'm going to give this to Israel. And I'm going to make them drink of it. It's the cup of my vengeance. It's a cup of suffering. And the Jewish people are going to drink from that cup. When they came pouring out the city to welcome him as he came down the Mount of Olives on the donkey, imagine what that must have been like for just a moment. They had been waiting for the king to come. They had gone out to the river to be baptized because they heard the kingdom of heaven is at hand. Repent and be baptized, and they had flooded down to the Jordan. They'd heard all the rumors about this baby in Bethlehem and about this man in the Galilee who was performing miracles and delivering people and teaching with such authority. Is that him? Could that be him? Is he here? Is he coming now? And then finally, it's the Passover week, and here he comes down the mountain on a donkey, and they pour out, as they did at Tabernacles in 2023, they poured out with excitement and waved their palm branches back then, and they said, Hosanna to the kingdom of our father David that comes in the name of the Lord. The king was coming, and they thought he was coming to reign. And as they came out with their smiles and their laughter and their applause and their cheers, Jesus started to weep. Because he knew. He knew what lay ahead for them. Those very same people who came to welcome their king, they would be slaughtered, die of siege. Some of them would even cook their own children and eat them as the Romans came around the city. And the nation that had come out to welcome their king would be driven out from their land and scattered to the four corners of the earth. And for 2,000 years, everywhere they went, they would be hated. Everywhere they went, they would be despised. People would try to kill them everywhere. And Jesus saw all that. But he's warned us. He said, I'm going to take the cup out of their hands. I'm going to bring them back. I couldn't gather them under my wings 2,000 years ago like a mother hen, and he wanted to. But now he says, the set time to favor Zion is come. I'm turning my face back to Zion. My light is rising over that land. I'm gathering my scattered people, and I'm going to keep them in the land as a shepherd keeps his flock. But the nations, I'm taking the cup out of Israel's hands. And I'm going to put it in the hands of South Africa and Australia and America and France, and I'm going to force them to drink. And I don't need to add to what he says in his word about how terrible the day of the Lord is going to be on our nations. It's what he says. He is furious with our nations. Because of this perversion, because of this, it's so wrong, it's so immoral, it's just criminal. I mean, there are no words. What your government and my government and all the Gentiles know. I'm looking for a glimmer of hope because there is this tension in the word. On the one hand, we read that all the nations will come against Israel. And when they do, the Lord himself will descend, and he's not coming to wave banners and blow shofars. He's coming for war. And he will go and fight on behalf of Israel against the nations. But Jesus also said something. Jesus said that when the nations are gathered for judgment, there will be an opportunity for some of those nations to win his favor because they have been sheep nations, because they have taken care of his brethren, because they visited them in prison and they fed them and clothed them and comforted them. And as he judges the nations, he will judge those who have cursed Israel, and we go back to the original biblical principle, all who curse the seed of Abraham, I will curse. And those who blessed. And he's blessed you Aussies. If there wasn't an Israel for me to live in, this is where I want to live. You have a lovely, you have a wonderful country. You're an incredible people. You've been forged in your own particular furnace. You have some peculiarities which the rest of us admire and envy sometimes, and you play regularly fairly okay football, but you have a legacy. You came out of something. You're celebrating it today. Although most of I have friends who are marching on the streets of Perth this morning, and their son is I think they call him a candidate policeman. I'm not sure the term. Anyway, they're marching. There's celebrations everywhere. I'm not sure how many of those celebrating on the streets really know what the Anzac legacy is from the position or the perspective of the kingdom of heaven. And so where are we now? And what's going to happen? I don't know. I'm not a prophet. I don't know which direction your country is going to take. I don't know. It's hard to believe, even though your prime minister did not really sanction or he didn't support what your foreign minister said about the state of Palestine, and there was a lot of pushback, a lot. And I do know that there are people who are praying for her removal. Okay, and again, this is your area, and I'm not going to say anything there. But what I do know is that people understand, Christians understand that actually God has given us an incredible amount of authority over our leaders. Go read Psalm 149. It applies to every one of you here. If you're a son or daughter of God, you have been given an authority by God to direct what your prime minister does in office. To either get him in or get him out. To change the direction that your nation goes in. I just am afraid that the urgency of the hour is not really registering. Now, I've been all over your country and I've had some amazing moments. I spoke in an Aboriginal church up a place called Yarrabah, up near Cairns. It wasn't a big gathering like yours, but at the end of the service, the whole congregation came forward. And the pastor prayed, and then he said, today we're going to write a petition. Let's get together now. Let's write to the Prime Minister, tell him we don't agree with recognizing Palestine. Let's do something. I spoke in a large church over in Perth on Sunday night. It was like this. There was all these bright lights in my face. I couldn't see how people were reacting. It's a bit better today. But as I came to the end of my message, I started to hear people crying. And as I walked back and took my seat, I heard people weeping all over the congregation. And their pastor led them in prayer, an urgent prayer. I know you love your country, and I know you want the best for Australia. I believe God loves Australia more than even you do. And I believe he wants to bless your country. But he's not a sugar daddy, and he doesn't hand out candy on the slot machine. He's looking for those, and he was looking for them here. He's looking for those who will go out and put on sackcloth and ashes and get on their faces and weep before God. Repenting. You can repent on behalf of your country. I think it's a cop-out to say, well, we didn't vote for that guy, and he's not our government. Doesn't matter. There were a lot of people who didn't support David, but when David sinned, tens of thousands of Israelites were judged by God. The thing is that actually in a democracy, there are so many avenues that we can follow, of course. And I don't think I need to share those with you, but I will say this, that what I've learned both here and in the United States is that the way your systems work is if you want to take a message to one of your leaders, don't send an email. If you can't get to them personally, make a phone call. If you can get to them personally, go visit them. They judge how seriously you take an issue by how much effort you're prepared to make to take the message to them. And I know that there are a growing number of Aussies who are wanting to get this word through to this government and say, we will not vote for you, we will not support you if you recognize Palestine. That's a red line for us. When I finished speaking with those parliamentarians, two things happened. One was that, as I said, they were all in the opposition. One thing was that the gentleman, his name is Andrew Wallace. You'll probably know him, some of you. He's from around here. He loves the Lord. He's a very courageous man. He went to Israel earlier on this year and came back, and he spoke very strongly in support of Israel. But he turned to the rest of the men, and there's a woman in the room, and he said, it's in our platform too. We're in opposition now, but it's in our platform. We support a two-state solution. And my message was, well, if you support a two-state solution, then you're supporting the destruction of Israel. And that was the message that they went away with. And can I ask you to pray for those sorts of seeds that are being planted in the minds of your leaders now? That if this is of the Lord, as I obviously believe it is, that God will water those seeds, He will bring confirmations, He will keep those men and that women awake at night, He will press on them the seriousness of this time. I also want to encourage you, if you'll let me, I know some of you are already doing this, and you have the Never Again Is Now movement that's that's gathering momentum here, and maybe someone wants to speak to that when I'm done. I know there have been a couple of big events, one in Sydney and one in Adelaide, and I think one's coming here soon. And that's a really important moment. Have any of you ever, can I have another 10 minutes or so, guys? Are we good? Have any of you ever wondered what you would have done if you'd been alive in Europe in the 1930s? We all know that the church was largely silent. And what I've been asking groups that I've spoken to around Australia is, can you name me, and I'll ask you now, can you name me someone who stood up for the Jews as the Nazis came to power and as the Holocaust was unfolding? Can you name somebody? William Cooper, he's one of yours. Okay. I find that not so many Aussies remember that name, but that's a very special name. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, Corrie ten Boom, Martin Niemöller, Schindler. If we work really hard, we can maybe come up with 10. You have to think about it. Up at Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Memorial Museum in Jerusalem, they have what's known as the Avenue of the Righteous Among the Gentiles, and they plant trees in the names of and the memories of Gentiles that stood with the Jewish people back then. It's not a very big grove. There are a few hundred trees. I sat with a rabbi in Melbourne the other day, and I said to him, Rabbi, if I had been alive in Europe in the 1930s, and I had some understanding of what I carry today, there are two things I would have wanted to do. I don't know whether I would have done them. I don't know whether I would have had the courage. Might have cost me my life. I don't know. But there are two things I would have wanted to do. The one is I would have wanted to do what Never Again Is Now wants to do. I would have wanted to shout as loudly as possible and get as many Christians together as possible and get out on the streets and push back against anti-Semitism and against the brown shirts and against the Nazis and make a very loud noise, because we did not want anti-Semitism to come to Germany, as you do not want anti-Semitism to flourish here. But the other thing that I would have done, if I'd had that knowledge, is to turn to the Jewish people and say, get out. We will hold back the flames, but get out. Leave. There were envoys who came from the land of Israel to Europe in the run-up to the Holocaust, and they saw what was coming. Because Hitler didn't keep it secret. He said what he was going to do. And they pleaded with the Jews of Germany, leave. And I said to the rabbi, how are you going to feel if a Gentile comes up to a Jew in Melbourne and says, or the Jewish friend in Melbourne says, you guys should pack up and leave, you should get going. Look at your history. Learn the lessons from your history. Don't let it catch you unawares again. The trend of anti-Semitism is not declining, it's growing. It's growing massively. And I do know that there are at least one or two Jews of my personal acquaintance here who are buying one-way tickets, or are talking about buying one-way tickets from Sydney to Tel Aviv and never coming back again. I don't know about what our role is there at this point in time, but I do know this: the Jewish people here in your country have been shocked into the realization that they are not safe, that they do not have the security that your government is supposed to give them, that your police force is supposed to give them, that ordinary Aussies are supposed to demand that they have. They are insecure. They have been shaken by fear. On Kristallnacht, some of you know, was the date that marked the beginning of the Holocaust, when the synagogues went up in flames across Central Europe. On that very night, in a synagogue in Caulfield, men came running into the synagogue. It was a Friday night, and said to the rabbi, get out, there's a mob coming. And the rabbi got out just before the mob arrived. And they stood outside the synagogue and launched their hatred at the Jews inside there. For many, many Jewish people now, there is a real sense of danger facing them. This is not outside our purview. We can do something about this. How many of you have been to synagogue? That's normally the response I get when I ask. Because mostly we don't. Mostly we don't. That's where the Jews do their thing and we do ours in the church. Can I challenge you to go to synagogue? Go on Friday night. Instead of watching that game or that movie, go to synagogue. When you get there, they'll ask you who you are. You'll have to write down your details because there are security concerns. But they'll welcome you. And when you go inside and you introduce yourself, they'll want to know what you're doing there. And whether you speak to one person or a small crowd gathers around you and you speak to a few of them, if you can just express to them a few words, appreciation for the fact that you as a Christian got your faith, your knowledge of God, your Bible, your biblical heroes, the disciples, and even Jesus himself from them. Everything that you cherish most, everything that has eternal value in your life, you got from the Jewish people. They wrote this book. It's all about them. And as Jesus said to the woman at the well, salvation is of the Jews. We owe, obviously. Jesus paid the price and opened the door. But everything we have, we got from that nation. If you've seen the movie Fiddle on the Roof, you'll remember that line when Tevye is going to celebrate the engagement of his daughter, and he hears from the police constable that there's going to be a pogrom. And the man can hardly stand on his feet because he's been having too much vodka, but he engages God in a conversation, and he says to the Lord, he says, I know we're your chosen people, but for once, can't you choose someone else? Because to be chosen is meant to pay a price. It has nothing to do with being superior or in some way God's favorites. No, not on the contrary. The chosen people have paid a price to be chosen. But they are lonely, brothers and sisters. They are in a great deal of pain. Some of them are more devout. Many of them are secular. I want to make a personal confession here. My feet are not very pretty. I'm going for surgery on both of them. They're a bit of a mess. But according to the Bible, if I go and stand and I speak to the Jewish people, and I say to them, to Jerusalem and to the cities of Judah, behold your God. The Bible calls my feet beautiful. How lovely on the mountains are the feet of them who bring good news, who speak to the Jewish people those words. Your God reigns. Or, in another passage, behold your God. When you share your faith in their God with them, and you say, I'm with you, I will fight against anti-Semitism, I want to be your friend, I believe in your future, I condemn what's happening in this country against your people, you speak comfort and encouragement in a way that will far outweigh your ability to measure it, because it is a measure of how lonely they are. The response that you will get from them. It's a commandment, you know. God says it to people who are not Jews. He says, comfort my people. Speak tenderly to them. I want to teach you one Hebrew word and then I'm done, and I'm open for questions. Any of you speak Hebrew? Did somebody say shalom? That's what they say a million times a day in Israel, probably 10 million times a day, because there's 10 million people there. Shalom, shalom, shalom. It means peace. And of course, it's the one thing that they haven't yet experienced. But there's another word. And if you're brave, say it with me. It goes like this. Hineni. Know what it means? It means here I am. I'll say it once more. No one in this room is less significant than the person next to you or in front of you or behind you. You are royalty if you are a son of the King. Go talk to him. Share. Ask him whether that South African who was speaking from the pulpit had maybe been in the sun too much. Was that too extreme a message? What he shared, was that from God? Ask the Lord to confirm it to you. To give you a sense of the urgency of this time. For Israel, sure, but also for Australia. And then if you will, say to him, Hineni, what do you want me to do? I'm not very influential. I can't write very good letters. I can't sing, whatever. I'm here. I want to do something. He will give you what to do. I believe he's looking for Australians who will get on their faces before him and make themselves available. Yes, for the sake of Zion. How many of you are watchmen on the walls of Jerusalem? That's my next trick question. I always ask people that one as well, and I get about that many hands going up. So let me quote the scripture to you. I have set watchmen on your walls, O Jerusalem, all you who make mention of the Lord. Give yourselves no rest and give him no rest until he establishes Jerusalem and makes her a praise in the earth. Now, how many of you make mention of the Lord? Don't be shy. Is he your God? You talk about him? Do you make mention of him? Well, I'm sorry, then your job description is to be a watchman. We have a calling. We're not disconnected. And it's a great calling to have, because we co-labor with God. We stand with him on the battlements. We see the enemy coming. And we respond. I think I'm done.